This is actually the hardening of an already existing blockade, which has been US policy essentially since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in the previous century. So we're seeing quite literally decades of efforts to asphyxiate the Cuban economy with the clear aim of undermining support for the Cuban Revolution to try to topple the government there. Obviously, first with Fidel Castro, then his brother Raul, and today with Miguel Diaz-Canel. The objective is clear. It's about trying to impose changes on the island because Cuba has always played a really important role in the imagination of the Latin American left. I think a lot of what we're seeing has to do with that, especially with actors like Marco Rubio in the White House, who's practically obsessed with the idea of overthrowing the Cuban Revolution. And that's because it's always been a source of inspiration for Latin America. You know, here in Latin America, we often say that it's the first free territory in the region. And by that, we mean that it was able to break the chains of US imperialism that was basically undermining any possibility of human development, of progress for the Cuban people before the revolution. And so, you know, we have this policy now of an oil blockade, and it's the correct term. This is a blockade. It is being enforced through the US's military might, through the deployment of the US Navy and the backing of the Pentagon in order to prevent fuel from arriving to Cuba. And as you said here in your introduction, what we're seeing is a man-made humanitarian catastrophe unfolding. This is not something that is the product, as the US claims, of mismanagement by the Cuban officials, or because, you know, there is a structural problem with the Cuban political economic system. It's because the United States is trying to undermine support inside the country and has been steadily ramping up. You know, there was for a moment during Obama's term a detente, right? It looked like there was going to be a new relationship after decades of efforts by the United States to overthrow the Cuban Revolution to finally enter a new era. Well, that didn't last very long because as soon as Trump came into office during his first term, he basically reversed all of that. And actually now in his second term, he's actually imposed new measures that have made things even worse. Just as an example, the US's blockade, and I think it's important to kind of specify why we call it a blockade and not an embargo, which is the term they use, is because it applies extraterritorially. It's not that Cuba can't do trade with the United States. That'd be one thing. If the United States government makes that decision, well, I suppose that they have that prerogative. What happens is that the US tries to impose this extraterritorially, try to prevent other countries from engaging in any kind of commerce that even remotely is associated with the United States. It used to be that anything that had 25% or more US products in it, well, it was subject to US regulations around preventing its importation into Cuba. Trump changed that to 10%, making it virtually impossible to get certain things because of the availability of US products everywhere, and it's very difficult to meet that threshold. But of course, now we're talking about this blockade, preventing oil from coming into the country through military might and through military threats. You know, you talked about the potential sanctions. Well, basically, Trump has told countries that they cannot sell oil to Cuba under the threat of punishing economic tariffs. In the case of Venezuela, they quite literally, using their military might, their presence in the Caribbean to prevent any Venezuelan oil from getting there. And that's actually been the case for a while now. Obviously, Venezuela's had its own particular political challenges over the last few years, and you know, they weren't able to supply as much. And interestingly enough, the country that kind of stepped up to provide oil to Cuba was Mexico. And so this threat of tariffs is on any country that provides oil to Cuba is essentially one that's directed at Mexico above all. And, you know, Mexico's in the midst of very sensitive negotiations around the USMCA. And so they've had to make the unfortunate decision to suspend their oil sales to Cuba out of fear of this economic retaliation by the United States, which would, of course, we should be clear, would be devastating for Mexico.